Welcome to A Real Affliction, BPD Culture and Stigma, the podcast devoted to exploring how we experience, treat, write about, advocate for, and conceptualize borderline personality disorder. My name is Cynthia Gralla. I'm a writer and teacher with a history of BPD. Trigger warning, this episode will talk about suicide and euthanasia. This is the second part of my interview with Lucy Yanow, who holds a master's in bioethics and society and formerly worked as a midwife and doula. In this episode, she and I will have a wide-ranging conversation about key texts on bioethics, spectro-reproductive justice, and questions surrounding bodily autonomy and sovereignty. Lucy and I first met when she interviewed me about a short story that I contributed to an anthology called Adventures in Bodily Autonomy, exploring reproductive rights in science fiction, fantasy, and horror, which was published last fall to raise money for NARAL Pro-Choice America. She offered fascinating perspectives on the ghost and wolves surrounding the Roe v. Wade decision in the US, and I didn't want our interview to end. Here, I ask her about reproductive rights, as well as two other current controversies related to bodily autonomy: involuntary hospitalization for mental illness and Canada's Medical Assistance in Dying program. In the San Francisco Bay Area, where both Lucy and I have lived, involuntary psychiatric holds are skyrocketing. Forced hospitalization is familiar to many of us with BPD, as we comprise roughly 20% of the inpatient psychiatric population. The issue evokes a lot of painful emotions for me. Involuntary hospitalization for anorexia as a child altered my relationship with medical authority figures, my body, and my life. Later, an involuntary hospitalization for suicidality almost ended that life. During one 72-hour psych hold, also known as a 5150, in San Francisco, I was attacked and almost killed by another patient who was in the midst of a psychotic break. In other words, I was forced to be in a vulnerable situation that caused tremendous physical and psychic pain. Yet in some cases, involuntary hospitalization can save lives. But whether they can help unhoused people in any meaningful long-term way is a different question. One housing nonprofit policy director scoffed at San Francisco's strategy of mandating that some unhoused mentally ill people be hospitalized temporarily. She said, "It's a well-known open secret amongst people who are doing mental health crisis work that a 5150 hold is often a ticket to nowhere, even in the case when it is necessary." In Canada, the Medical Assistance in Dying program, or MAID, is inciting even more heated debate. Euthanasia has been legal in Canada since 2016, but so far, only those with grievous physical illnesses have been allowed to access it. The program is also limited to people eligible for Canadian medical coverage to prevent what is called suicide tourism. In January 2024, spokespeople for MAID announced that they were introducing legislation to delay the expansion of the program to those suffering primarily from mental illnesses for at least another 3 years, despite a previous goalpost for expansion in March 2024. Questions about autonomy in mental illness rage amid this debate. One Canadian woman with mental illness despaired at the postponement, claiming that it was discriminatory and that no available treatment has assuaged her agony. Meanwhile, Neil MacArthur, director of the Centre for Professional and Applied Ethics at the University of Manitoba, argued mental illness can affect someone's autonomy, the capacity to make an informed, uncoerced decision. In the second and final part of our interview, Lucy and I ruminate on the ultimate unattainability of bodily autonomy and why all of us need to educate ourselves in bioethics. I'd like to talk about these issues related to bodily autonomy, and just to give some background, maybe give some background about your dissertation or your research generally, your research interests.
Yeah. So I think I mentioned earlier, I worked in a hospital. So I worked as an abortion counselor and I worked in abortion clinics for like 15 years. And then I also studied midwifery and I attended many births
And this is all in the US that you're working in
All in the
abortion. Okay.
San Francisco Bay Area,
Okay. Sorry.
in California. I was working in a hospital during the pandemic, and I was somebody who had an abortion. I had two abortions, one when I was 18 and one when I was 21.
Mhm.
So I have this sort of interest in reproduction in general, and I've companioned reproduction. And yet, when Roe v. Wade was overturned, I was not prepared.
Mhm.
I had taught doulas, so I had kind of also come up with some curriculum around reproductive justice and the
Mhm.
and intersectionality. Anyway, so my research really stemmed from my lived experience, but what I was really inquiring about was the potential of speculation, because when Roe v. Wade was overturned, I could no longer even dream of a better option for reproduction. It was like
Right.
such a trauma response. I was like, it's always just going to be like abortion is only going to be harm reduction. And now it's not even going to be that. And at a
Right.
different time in my life, I had had this utopian vision of what abortion could be, what self-managed abortion could be. I had
Mhm.
belonged to collectives and we had taught ourselves like different self-managed abortion techniques,
Mhm.
different self-help groups. Like I had done a lot of stuff. So my research inquiry became how I think my thesis or my primary question was like, how has the practice of speculation changed for like expert speculators post Roe v. Wade? And I defined expert speculators as people with public facing work about abortion, about reproduction, about bodily autonomy. So what I found was that in many of the public facing works, time was sort of out of joint, which is
Mhm.
the phrase that Derrida pulls from
Yes.
Shakespeare,
Yes.
would
Inspectors of
indicate
marks. Yeah.
inspectors of marks, that would indicate a hauntological discourse, which is
Mhm.
how is the past affecting how people are making sense of the present and how are they going to bring that forward? So I kind of applied this hauntological framework to the reversal of Roe v. Wade based on the interviews that I did. Reproductive decision making is hauntological because the individual always, in order to decide what to do, is projecting a
Yes.
future self or a
Yeah.
future other. There's always
Mhm.
that projection and
Mhm.
weighing these two potential ghosts. And that is something that I think is often lost when we talk about reproductive decision making. And there's these laws that legislate this process, this incredibly personal process, this
Right.
process that in and of itself, and because of where it's located in our current socio-political climate, especially, right, it's going to, and then we legislate that, and all of a sudden these ghosts become a poltergeist, right?
Mm-hmm.
I concluded by proposing that we consider not just reproductive justice, but like spectro-reproductive justice is what I called it. And this idea
Mm-hmm.
that like these ghosts matter. Speculation is the way that we're allowed to dance with them. And I really stole, and I really need to think of a better metaphor because I do recognize that it's cultural commodification. But I really drew from Gayatri Spivak, who writes about the ghost dance and the ethics of the
Right.
ghost dance, because the ghost dance was this very marginalized group who literally embodied their ancestors as protection. And
Mhm.
then that dance, that performance of the self and the ancestor became the
Mhm.
justification. It was such a threat. The colonizers used it as an excuse for genocide. And that, I think, is what overturning Roe v. Wade can be seen as being akin to. I mean, we're not just putting up even more barriers to life-saving healthcare, but I think what it did was it said your dreams, your speculation, your projection of self and other are now criminalized.
Right. Not just
Right?
invalidated, but criminalized.
Not just invalidated, but criminalized, even for people in states where abortion is still legal, they still now swim in that discourse.
Right.
They still
Definitely.
have to deal with the way that overturning that law changed their conception of their own womb.
We were talking a little about involuntary hospitalization, which I'm quite familiar with in terms of the state of California. I imagine all the state laws are slightly different. In California, though, you can be placed on a 5150 hold for up to 72 hours if you're considered a danger to yourself, also a danger to someone else. And if you're, I think it's the wording is gravely disabled or just unable to take care of yourself. When I was looking at articles about hospitalization in California, they often cite that one. Well, these are people who can't take care of themselves. They're on the streets. And after a 5150, it can be expanded to a 5250, which is, I think, an additional 2 weeks. And it's a tricky thing because for me, the experience of forced hospitalization was always super traumatic because I had awful experiences in psychiatric hospitals as a child. So I had initial traumas and then traumas from that. And so, the forced hospitalizations were not easy, even though it's possible once or twice they saved my life. And I think with unhoused people, it gets even trickier because you could argue, well, they're being given a warm place to sleep, at least for a few nights. Maybe they can get some kind of help, but if they're just put back where they were, can you shed any light on that debate based on your perspective as an expert in bioethics?
Well, so there's these four principles of bioethics. I was in this sort of like critical studies of bioethics or critical studies, and it was housed in a global health and social medicine department.
Mm-hmm.
But you'll also see bioethics in law schools and you'll see them in medical schools. But that is not the perspective of the study that I did. So mine was a little bit more social science, like medical anthropology, medical sociology, like critical theory. But traditional bioethics came about, I think, in like 70 with this guy, Childress, and he, maybe 72. Anyway, he came up with this. It's the four principles of bioethics, which is beneficence, non-malfeasance, autonomy, and justice.
Mm-hmm.
There's these four principles because doctors basically had this free reign for so long and there was no guiding. It was just like the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm, but that's complicated, right?
Is, yeah.
And this is, I think, what we see with this idea of like 5150 holds or any kind of thing that might intrude on somebody's autonomy, but it might be a beneficent choice, right? Like you said, it gives somebody a place to sleep. It might save their life. It might seem like non-malfeasance. It might seem to the doctor like it's the right thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
It might seem just because it would be just to society to get this person off the street for a while, right? Like, so these concepts in and of themselves, also, it's like justice for who? For the individual? Or like, when do we sacrifice autonomy for justice? When are we focusing on the kindest thing that the practitioner can do, right? That's like non-malfeasance and beneficence. That's really centering actually the practitioner. So bioethics is kind of a multidisciplinary study, and so there's no clear answer. And it takes a little bit also from philosophy. Mm-hmm. And continental philosophy. So it's how do we ask the right questions? I think what I would ask is, what do the people who are being involuntarily detained, what would they want? What would be best for them? How do we build a system for them? The hospital I worked at in San Francisco was a place where on a different floor, we held people for 72-hour holds. Right. It's in the middle of the Mission. Yeah. Which is also
I've been there. I've been in that psych ward too, waiting to get transferred to a private hospital. It's pretty grim there. It's just like one room, everyone thrown together, just sleeping on the couches. It's strange.
I don't think I've ever been in that ward, but I would see people after they were discharged. And I would see them sleeping in the hospital socks on the street of the Mission. And then I would see people with their ear pods in, stepping over them to get on the Google bus. So the question is, how do we build a society where people don't step over the people in the hospital socks?
Right. Well, I agree. One thing I've found out in researching BPD specifically is that it does seem like countries with great income inequality seem to be hotbeds for the disorder. It doesn't necessarily mean like cause versus correlation here. It's kind of hard to determine. It could just be these are the type of places where they're more likely to give a diagnosis. But yeah, San Francisco is one place where you just, in the Mission, where you see both extremes of great poverty and great wealth. And yes, how do we care for people in that context? And I think that question, and the other question I would say is just how do we conceive of autonomy in terms of mental illness? Because I think there's something like you're suggesting something that sounds really good to me. Why don't we ask the person what they think? I think there's often an assumption that someone who is mentally ill just can't make their own decisions. And I think sometimes that is absolutely true. And at other times it isn't. And then the problem becomes how do you distinguish between the two? And I was talking to you a little before the interview about the expansion of Canada's medical assistance in dying program, which they just put off in February 2024 for another 3 years in terms of possibly expanding it to accommodate people whose primary complaint is a mental illness, not a physical illness. And some people who wanted to use it for that because they just hadn't found any treatments helpful for mental illness said, well, that's discriminatory. And then Neil MacArthur, the director of the Center for Professional and Applied Ethics at the University of Manitoba, said mental illness can affect someone's autonomy, the capacity to make an informed, uncoerced decision. So yes, what I just acknowledged, that can be the case. I mean, going forward, how can we think in a more nuanced way about mental illness and autonomy?
I think it's a great question. And I think that I think in terms of bioethics, again, sometimes it's just about forming a question
Absolutely.
because we're kind of just not there yet. I think, how could we come up with like some kind of ethical edict? What do we live in such an unethical
Well,
world?
yeah, I mean
Um,
that's true too.
I think what's coming into my mind is a concept called relational autonomy.
Mhm.
And relational autonomy, I'm not an expert in it. It really came from the disability justice movement. And so I think that's part of maybe the way that I'll like steer this conversation, but I want to go back a little bit to my own research. And one of the things
Yeah.
that I didn't explore too much in my research, but that came up for me a lot when thinking about this idea of autonomy and being autonomous. And at a certain point, I got real annoyed with this idea of autonomy because who is autonomous?
Right. We're
I
all
guess some
dependent on other people. Yeah.
to different degrees,
Yeah.
right? And if you have the capacity to get pregnant, you are never autonomous because your
Yeah.
womb is this liminal space that has this
Mhm.
potential, right? Whether we
Yeah.
want to explore it or not. So I titled my dissertation The Haunted Womb because I think that we have constructed a womb in our society that is whatever our personal desires are, it is haunted by the potential of the other, or it is haunted by a literal other that is no longer in there. Who is truly autonomous?
But I think,
But then,
people who have families, you already have all these
right.
interrelationships. And
Like
even,
maybe
yeah.
maybe that guy in that movie, Christian Bale in that movie who kills people.
Yeah, American Psycho, he's
Yeah,
autonomous, but
he
yeah,
he might be
right.
autonomous,
Yeah,
but
it's
even
true that like extreme autonomy almost presupposes a kind of really like almost like a sociopathic or psychopathic
right,
state, because it would say that you don't care about anyone around you or your effect on any, you can do what you want, which is a
right,
dangerous thing. Yeah.
right. So this concept of autonomy, we hold it
Yeah.
up with bioethics, but it's unattainable. I think it's
Right.
unattainable. And I don't think it should be the goal. And so, in interrogating bodily autonomy,
Mm.
I actually got really annoyed with bodily autonomy because I was like,
Mm.
how can we say that, like, the goal should be that, like, you get to make a decision for your body this heavy decision, this challenging decision. Again, I'm thinking about this in the abortion context, right? And I worked with people who really struggled with the decision, and had moral
Yeah.
conflict or emotional conflict or spiritual conflict or just were ambivalent, And one of the questions that I would ask often was like, how are you being supported? And they would inevitably say, and kind of always in this monotone voice, my partner's really supportive. They say it's my choice and they're okay with whatever I decide to do. And I'd be like, how is that for you? And they would be
Yeah.
like, he's really great. And I think part of it was like, oh, they're like, people are scared of the gatekeeping aspect. They think if they don't say the right thing, they're gonna like,
Yeah.
right? Like I'm a figure of authority, even though I don't see myself as that, but I was a mandated reporter. But it was also this sense of like, we did this thing together, and
Mm.
now the liberated thing to do is to make this decision all by myself.
Yeah, that's controversial to some people, but yeah, if you're in a partnership with someone, even if it's
Right?
should you have some kind of communication about it, I would feel very alone if my spouse said to me, "Oh, it's completely your decision." But that's just, but I would, if he said, which he never would, like, "Oh, no, I don't let you do this." That would be horrific. But I don't know, just saying it's completely your decision because it's your body. I totally get where he'd be coming from, but there is something kind of like, well, but we share our lives. It's complicated. Yeah,
It's so
absolutely.
complicated,
Yeah.
And so I think this concept of autonomy is also, it's like the pendulum swings back and forth, right? So there
Yeah.
used to be no autonomy, like people with uteruses had no autonomy. They needed to get permission or they didn't have access to care. And now in swinging the other way, it's become like people don't know how to support people in their decision making around
Right.
their bodies because they're scared of intruding on their autonomy, right? Because
Yeah.
it's become this like pedestaled quality.
Yeah. And I think Judith Butler wrote about this idea a little bit in it's like The Force of Nonviolence. I don't know if you've read that book,
Yeah.
but I think she was talking about just all these like these romanticized ideals we have about individualism in, Western philosophy and culture. But when are you a sovereign individual? You would die if you were born into this world as just a separate, completely isolated individual. But it's such an important thing, especially within American thinking, I believe, just this idea that it's just what you want, the individual wants, but it doesn't actually exist, like you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, sovereignty is another one. I had this lecture, I had this one class in my master's, and it was taught by a lawyer and a political science expert, and I didn't really study political science. And I swear we had like 4 lectures on the Treaty of Westphalia, which is when sovereignty was introduced as a concept and a value. Because
Mhm.
right before that, it was like the divine right of kings, and that was really the only like
Right.
person who had any kind of like, so
Yeah.
all of a sudden we had sovereignty, but what sovereignty did was it developed the nation state, right? And so when we superimpose that concept onto our
Yeah.
organic, entangled,
Yeah, it's very
like,
entangled.
nature culture, superimpose these like concepts and we try to make them work, but
Right.
I am no more sovereign over my uterus than the government. My uterus got pregnant twice against my will. My uterus like rebels every month and I have
Yeah.
like horrible cramps.
Mhm.
My uterus and I don't always see eye to eye. So like I do not have
Yeah.
any sovereignty
No,
over my.
that's really an interesting way of putting it. I have endometriosis, so yeah, I definitely did not sign up for some of the things, the cyst, the pain that, and you can also argue the same thing when this is really personal, but whatever. It's a podcast where I'm talking about personal things. I do seem to be in that kind of countdown of the year to menopause. I haven't had a period for over 6 months, which is really good in my case because it dealt with, the endometrial pain was so tied to periods. But, you don't give permission for when it starts and stops. And also, like, there are some really fascinating debates that come up with endometriosis too. I've seen a number of women on forums just being told by their doctors because for people who don't know, there's no cure for endometriosis, but for many people, if they get a hysterectomy, the pain will stop. But I've seen a number of women say, my doctor told me, my GYN told me I can't get a hysterectomy because I'm in my 20s and I might change my mind about having children. Like they tell the doctor, I don't want to have children. Oh, you'll change your mind. You could change your mind. I mean, that's definitely ontological. Like you're valuing the possible future, not even the future baby, the future desire to have a baby. Because the other problem here is that about 50% of women with severe endometriosis are infertile. So this woman may not even be able to have a child, but that is privileged over her wants and her pain. So yeah, we could have a whole episode on kind of a lot of different things we're picking apart here. But I think that what you said is really powerful, that this idea of autonomy is unattainable. One of my final questions, and also you can talk about anything you want to finish up with, but is there any reading on bioethics that you would recommend for like a layperson on the subject? Because I feel like what you're saying is so true that we need to start asking these questions. You know, when we're part of societies that are outlawing abortion, that are allowing medical assistance in dying, that are making more moves to involuntarily hospitalize people, arguably rather than fixing a problem with wealth inequality or lack of housing or lack of access to mental health resources. We need to be educated. These are literally life and death decisions. So I haven't read much on bioethics, and I imagine for a lot of people that might be the case. Where could we start?
That's a good question. So you mentioned Judith Butler. I find Judith Butler to be extremely helpful. I read Maria Puig de la Bella Casa's Matters of Care. I read some of the works of Rosie Braidotti, and I read some Donna Haraway. And
Yeah, I like her a
I'll
lot.
say, I didn't realize how many lectures there are on YouTube.
Yeah, yeah, it's a tremendous resource.
Because again, bioethics came from, the horrors of the Holocaust and medical experimentation
Right.
and Tuskegee and
Yeah,
years and years and years of horrible medical experimentation. All of these like very unethical practices by folks who had taken this oath that was to do
right,
no, but then you get this idea, okay, but where do we go to consider ethics? Well, we go to philosophical traditions. And
right.
what is philosophy primarily? Like quite utilitarian, like mainstream
Mhm.
philosophy. It's like,
Yeah,
and when suddenly utilitarianism, then we're not talking about meeting everybody's needs. We're meeting the needs of most people, but that means what about everybody else, right?
right.
So,
And that's not even bringing in nature. And I mean, that's
right,
another ghost haunting our whole talk about bodily autonomy. If your choices affect your kind of natural environment, and certainly our choices have,
right.
it just spirals out.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely, right? So all of a sudden personhood is on top of the
Yes.
ladder. And
Yeah.
I mean, that's a whole different conversation, but it's also the
Yeah.
same conversation, right? Like
Yeah, people are interested in that one. That's something that I know Donna Haraway definitely touches on, and she's really fun to read too, I think.
more fun to watch on YouTube. So yeah, podcasts are amazing. Sophie Lewis is amazing. They wrote a book called Full Surrogacy Now. So that's, I think, for people who are really interested in this idea of the liminal uterus and uterine ge she's a human geographer.
But I will put all of these kind of suggestions and
Yeah.
resources in the notes.
But I just think read about feminism, whatever way that you can, because yeah, read Herland. Tell me what you
Yeah,
think.
yeah, let's give one more shout out to Charlotte
Charlotte
Perkins
Perkins
Gilman.
Gilman.
I will almost certainly break this talk up into like two or three different episodes. So we do talk about Charlotte Perkins Gilman in an earlier installment, author of The Yellow Wallpaper. Yeah, no, these are great suggestions. Are there any like final comments or things you want to share or say? I say in the first episode of this podcast that it's about broadening the possibilities and asking questions as resistance against this kind of narrowing I think we're seeing in a lot of spaces. It's hard to have answers, but just asking these questions is so helpful.
I don't know if I have any last things. I feel like I didn't really explain what relational autonomy was, but
Mm.
that's okay. Maybe that's something that I would give another shout out to for people to read about. And disability
Okay.
justice,
Yeah.
reproductive justice. I think these are really fundamental and very important concepts that don't get enough play.
Thank you so much for this conversation, Lucy. I always learn so much from talking to
Oh,
you.
I just feel so grateful to be asked and to be here and to connect with you again.
Yeah.
I feel like, yeah, affirmed by you.
Oh,
So
good. That's wonderful. That's a wonderful thing to hear. And I think the work you're doing is so valuable. So I expect we'll be getting books from Lucy in the future. So just keep your eye
aw,
out for those. So
thank you. And, I think the work that you're doing, I mean, teaching, reading and speculation and literature is our escape, whether it's
yeah,
creating it or reading it, right? They can legislate whatever they want, but we can always dream,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
And I feel like teaching people to read, teaching people to write. I mean, not that you're teaching people to read, but you know what I mean.
You
That's
are though. I mean,
so,
I think with literature or whether it's teaching them to read literature or academic articles, and I do both, it's teaching them to think critically. Although I don't know if you can teach that, but you can really encourage it and maybe open up a space
I mean,
for it or the
I think that's the most revolutionary thing you can do. So I'm grateful for the work that you do in this world, you know?
thank you so much, Lucy.